Welcome to Deep in the Stripes, the sickest Bengals podcast around. I am your host, Elise Jesse, and we've got to talk about free agency or the lack of moves that the Bengals have made in free agency. We got to talk about expectations, and we're also going to point to, or actually look at, what the Bengals might be leading towards in the draft, what free agency is telling us. Let's get into it.
Turn up your volume. Because you're about to listen to The Sick Podcast. Deep in the Stripes with Elise Jesse.
From 31 yards, McPherson. And Cincinnati is heading to the Super Bowl. They did it. They beat Mahomes at home. Wow, Joe Burrow. No way.
The sickest Cincinnati Bengals podcast. It's gonna be sick.
So Bengals free agency might be making you sick at this point. Some people have been very, very upset about the Bengals' lack of activity in free agency. They have made some, I don't want to say minor moves because I don't want to offend the players, but it's not exactly like big splash moves that maybe some of us were expecting to see. Now, if you're me, I'm not mad. I'm not upset. I'm not freaking out because this tiger has shown its stripes before. You've got to pay attention to what their history is. With Marvin Lewis, they gave Marvin 3 years to do whatever he wanted until they started to take hold of those reins a little bit more. We are starting to see that, in my opinion, with Zach Taylor. I think that's why we saw some of the big splash moves when Zach first got here. The trade for BJ Hill with Billy Price, the big signing where the Bengals gave DJ Reader the biggest contract he had ever seen at that point in his career. Those were early on in Zach Taylor's career. Now we are starting to see what the Bengals have done in the past, particularly with Marvin Lewis. So they did sign he's got run-stopping capabilities. I like this signing. TJ Slayton, 2 years, defensive tackle. He's a former Packer. He spent 4 years with them. Big dude, too. He's 6'4", 340, played in 68 games, 36 starts, 6 TFLs, 2 sacks, 4 passes defensed. So, yeah, I think he would be a pretty decent addition. He does have some postseason experience as well under his belt. I like to pay a lot of attention to the offensive line and the defensive line. I really think in the era of fantasy football, people really don't tend to pay enough attention to the offensive line and the defensive line because it's not the sexiest position. Let's be honest here. The sexiest positions are the positions where you have your quarterback, your running backs, your receivers. Like those are the positions that most people tend to pay attention to. But I think it's so important to focus on the D-line and O-line. Right now, the Bengals seem to re-signing and signing new players for their defensive line. They re-signed Joseph Osai to 1 year. They re-signed Cam Sample to 1 year. I'm really interested to see how Jerry Montgomery works with these two guys, what he pulls out of them. Miles Murphy is included in that. I really want to see how these guys progress over the summer, especially in training camp, and how maybe they have better technique. Maybe they're more confident in their abilities. Maybe they feel like they're in better positions to succeed. I am interested to see how they shape up this summer for sure. The Bengals re-sign the big beard, deep voice, big beard, Samaje Perine. He is back, and I thought it was interesting that he was talking about him wanting to come back to Cincinnati because of Joe Burrow. And he specifically mentioned that what he likes about Joe Burrow is that Joe Burrow is very direct. Like he's not going to mess around with you. He's not going to play games, but then he's also someone on the team who is open. So like for example, Samaje Perine, if he sees a different look or if he has a different idea of what might work for him, he feels free to go to Joe about that. The fact that that was a big selling point for him in re-signing with the Cincinnati Bengals outside of money says a lot. Joe Burrow is a big, important piece in Cincinnati, not just because of his play, not just because of his stats, but because of the way that he communicates with his teammates. That seems to be a common thread that people point to when they're talking about the Cincinnati Bengals. They also re-signed BJ Hill to a 3-year contract. I don't know when I said this, but I believe it maybe have been somewhere in November, December, maybe. And I was just talking about the importance of re-signing BJ Hill. He is a key component of this defensive line. And though he does not get as much praise as I think probably he should, the money speaks for itself. They decided that he was worth a 3-year deal. So 50 starts. You guys kind of know the stats since 2021. 225 tackles, 19 tackles for loss, 16 sacks, 13 PEDs, 2 interceptions. Like the list just goes on. BJ Hill is also a glue guy for that defensive line room. First of all, the defensive line, I've talked a little bit with Juliana. She's behind the camera doing some of the work for me for this podcast, actually hit airwaves or hit the internet. Just the personalities in the locker room. My 2 favorite sets of personalities are the defensive line because they're hilarious and the offensive line because all we talk about is food. It's great. I love those two positions for that reason. Bengals also signed cornerback Marco Wilson to a 1-year deal, and they also finally re-signed or extended one of the guys that Joe Burrow was making a case for in New Orleans during Super Bowl week, Mike Gesicki. He's rich now. What I don't like is that he's got a $7.6 million cap hit against the Bengals in 2025. He signed a 3-year deal. Do I think that was an important signing for the Cincinnati Bengals? Yes, absolutely, I do. The structure, good for Mike. Good for Mike on that one. They also extended backup guard Cody Ford or tackle. I mean, he's pretty versatile. So I feel like re-signing him was a good move because he can fill in multiple spots on the offensive line. It's not a big splash extension by any means, in my opinion. And that's not to, dig on him at all, but it's just, you need more size. You need more athleticism at those positions for starters, in my opinion. And what this is telling me, I at the very start of this podcast, I was telling you guys, we need to talk about we can read into with free agency and what that points towards for the draft. Honestly, the fact that they have signed, some players that, Joe Burrow wanted, a cornerback. They went heavy on defensive line in free agency with extensions and signing other guys like TJ Slayton. That tells me, if you look at the Bengals history, that tells me that they're setting things up to go heavy with offensive line in the draft. Now, should we be worried about that? I think, yeah, probably so. A little bit. When's the last time that they hit on the offensive line in the draft? It has been a very long time. Decade. Maybe more than that. I am disappointed that people were saying that they couldn't sign Kevin Zeitler. I would have loved to see Kevin Zeitler back in this building because I think he would have protected Joe. He has done a great job since leaving the Bengals. And he signed with the Tennessee Titans, actually, but Bengals. You got to protect this. You got to protect your quarterback. You can't continue to spend multiple years getting sacked 40 or more times every single year. You're not going to get 10 years out of this guy if you continue to put him in those positions. And I've said this a million times. Think of what Joe Burrow's stats could be if he was not running for his life on almost every play. I would love to see it. I feel like we would be even more entertained than we were last season. I hope that they make good picks for the offensive line because we are not seeing them get better on the offensive line in free agency. We haven't seen it. So that tells me they're going to focus on new guys coming in and they're going to try to develop those guys. Could be good. We'll see. I guess we'll all hold our breath. Am I shocked that they are going that route? No. Am I disappointed? No. And this is another thing that we have to talk about. In my life, I don't know about you guys, but in my life, this has served me very well. So I'm just going to say it out loud. I do not put expectations on anybody, because when you put expectations on people, you will get your feelings hurt. Essentially, I don't put expectations on anybody. I think what a lot of people need to start doing now is transferring that philosophy to the Cincinnati Bengals organization. There were a lot of expectations put on them when they went on their Super Bowl run in 2021. The expectation was to go back to the playoffs. The expectation was to go back to the Super Bowl. That hasn't happened. They've missed the playoffs 2 years in a row, and everyone is upset. You will save yourself so much anguish if you stop putting high expectations on this team. And it's kind of hard to avoid that, I know, but the front office is the same. The owners making the final decisions, they are the same people. They have habits. They have a history. Pay attention to that. Stop living in the world of high expectations, and you will not spend your days worried or angry or frustrated over this team. It is what it is. That's what we move forward with. That's how I move forward with it. That's how I move forward with it. I don't get upset when they don't do jack in free agency, because that's their MO. I don't have an expectation that they are going to make a big splash play, a big splash signing in free agency. Just because they did it the first few years of Zach Taylor's career, does not mean that will continue under Zach Taylor's reign. That's not how they've traditionally done it. Take those expectations off, at least if you want to have a peaceful summer. That is my rant about expectations. Just take them off. You'll have a good summer if you do that. And I also fell into that valley too, where after they competed for a Super Bowl, ultimately losing to the LA Rams, I was like, okay, but even though they lost in that moment, that will give them, that experience will give them the motivation to continue this push to that moment again. And I really believed that. But at this point, and I'm not trying to be a Debbie Downer at this point, it's just I'm looking at this from a realist perspective. They are what they are. They've shown you who they are for years, for decades. They've shown you what they are and what they're willing to do and for how long, what they're not willing to do. We can talk about Trey Hendrickson, for example. They gave him agency to go out and find a trade partner. And what is the news that comes out about Trey just recently? I believe it was today that it came out, where teams were willing to pay Trey Hendrickson that money, 32, 33 mil. What they didn't like were the terms that the Bengals were also attaching to that. They did not like the trade terms that the Bengals were coming with. So as far as market, what Trey Hendrickson is worth, what he deserves, what other teams would be willing to pay him, I think that the Bengals now understand, or should understand, that money is not a bad deal. Giving Trey more money is not a bad deal. Yes, he's 30. I've told you a million times, they are going to ding him on his age on paper, which they have in the past. That's also history. I think that they should be more willing to get this deal done. Other teams, yeah, they'd love a Trey Hendrickson on their defensive line. They just don't want to mess around with the crap the Bengals are trying to attach to it as far as trade terms are concerned. So my question is, what are you going to do about it? When are you going to do these deals? I'm not, like I've said already in this podcast, I'm not mad. I'm not furious with their lack of action here. I'm just bored. This is boring to me. Inactivity is so boring. Not signing your stars to big deals is boring. It's so boring. We are living in a state where this franchise is full of, I don't even want to say it because I don't want to be mean. I'm trying to be nice these days. What they haven't done is sign Jamar Chase. What they haven't done is sign T. Higgins. They tagged T. Higgins with the intent to sign him, but we still have not seen anything that would suggest that they are close to a deal on that front. Haven't signed Trey. What's taken so long? That's my question, I think. That's my biggest question regarding these stars. What's taking so long? Get it done, get it signed, sealed, delivered, make it happen. Start shaping your team for 2025. The Bengals' inability to get their stars signed is utterly ridiculous. It should be a case study at this point. The franchise, I always think about how franchises like the Philadelphia Eagles would respond if they were in the same position as the Cincinnati Bengals. I think we would have a much different offseason so far than we've seen with the Cincinnati Bengals. That is my take. Get your stars signed. They're going offensive line in the draft, in my opinion. And free agency, it's boring. That's what we expect. I'll see you next week.
And that's a wrap. Hope you don't miss us too much until next time. Follow the Sick Podcast Deep in the Stripes with Elise Jesse on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, Google Play, and Apple Podcasts.